March 1945. Kisarazu Airfield, Japan. Dawn breaks through a pale mist, painting the edges of the runway in dull silver. The air smells of oil and burnt rubber, the remnants of another night under alert. Japanese ground crewmen move slowly between half-buried hangars, their uniforms dusted with ash. Then, one of them freezes. A distant rumble echoes from above. Faint at first, then growing. The men look up. High over the clouds, thin contrails begin to cross and twist, forming vast white webs across the sky. The bombers are back, but this time, something different. Smaller shapes dart among the B-29s. Fast, deliberate, like hawks circling giants. The crews stare, blinking against the glare. These are not interceptors. They are escorts, American fighters, operating impossibly far from any known Allied base. The sound that follows is sharp and deep, the distinctive snarl of the Merlin engine cutting through the air. The Mustangs dive briefly, sunlight flashing off their polished fuselages, before climbing again to shield the bombers. For the first time, Japanese soldiers witness a new kind of dominance. Speed, precision, and range beyond comprehension. They whisper to each other in disbelief. How could enemy fighters have come this far? By 1943, the air war over Europe had become a brutal test of endurance. American bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators were striking deep into German industrial territory, but they were paying a terrible price. Without fighter protection, formations were torn apart by experienced Luftwaffe pilots flying Bf-109s and FW-190s. The United States Army Air Forces knew that to win, they had to reach the target and return. Range had become as vital as firepower. Early escort fighters like the P-38 Lightning and P-47 Thunderbolt were formidable, but their range limited them to the French coast or Western Germany. Once the bombers crossed the Rhine, they were on their own, flying hundreds of miles without cover. Loss rates soared. Crews gave the stretch beyond escort range a grim name: the Black Corridor. In this crisis, attention turned to a small California company, North American Aviation, originally contracted to build P-40s for Britain. The company proposed a new design instead: a fighter with cleaner aerodynamics, a more efficient airframe, and an advanced laminar flow wing that would reduce drag and extend range. The British agreed, and within 4 months, the prototype NA-73X was ready, the aircraft that would become the P-51 Mustang. The first Mustangs arrived in Britain in late 1942, powered by the Allison V1710 engine. At low altitudes, they performed well, but above 15,000 feet, where bomber formations flew, the Allison's single-stage supercharger failed to deliver power. British engineers soon discovered the solution: the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, already transforming the Spitfire and Hurricane. When American engineers fitted a Packard-built version of that same Merlin into the Mustang's sleek fuselage, the transformation was instant. The P-51B and C variants now climbed faster, flew higher, and cruised farther than any fighter of the war. With external drop tanks, they could escort bombers to Berlin and back, over 1,600 kilometers of range. By early 1944, the skies above Germany had changed. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, was forced onto the defensive. Mustangs roamed freely at high altitude, hunting interceptors before they could reach the bombers. For the first time, American formations reached their targets under constant cover. The results were devastating for Germany's air arm. Between January and June 1944, the Luftwaffe lost thousands of aircraft and hundreds of its most experienced pilots. Allied air superiority became irreversible. But the Mustang's legacy was not limited to Europe. It would soon find a new purpose across an even wider ocean. As the war turned toward the Pacific, the U.S. faced another logistical nightmare: The Japanese home islands lay far beyond the range of most Allied aircraft. Even the mighty B-29 Superfortress, operating from newly captured bases in the Marianas, could barely reach Tokyo. And without fighter escort, each raid risked catastrophic losses. The Pacific demanded an aircraft that could combine endurance with power, speed with range, and in the hangars of Inglewood, California, engineers were already refining the next evolution of the Mustang, a variant that would fly farther than any single-engine fighter ever built. The P-51D was coming. It would change not only the balance of air power, but also how the enemy viewed distance itself. By mid-1944, the United States had turned its full industrial and strategic focus toward Japan. The island-hopping campaign was closing in, base by base, from the Marshalls to the Marianas, through Saipan and Tinian, each one a stepping stone toward the enemy's mainland. With every captured airfield, the circle tightened. Yet one problem persisted: distance. Tokyo was nearly 1,500 miles from the nearest major Allied base. Even the long-legged B-29 Superfortress, the largest bomber of its time, flew at the edge of its range. Every raid meant hours of exposure over open sea, with no fighter escort and limited rescue options. When Japanese fighters struck, the bombers had to rely on formation fire alone. American planners knew this could not continue. The Pacific War was as much about logistics as combat. The air campaign required a fighter that could accompany bombers from island bases to Japan and back. A 2,500-mile round trip through hostile skies. It was, at the time, an unthinkable demand. But in the Mustang, engineers had already found the answer. The new P-51D variant, equipped with the Packard-built Merlin V1657 engine, featured a larger canopy for improved visibility, 650 caliber Browning machine guns, and crucially, the ability to carry two 75-gallon drop tanks beneath its wings. Combined with internal fuel, it could fly more than 1,600 miles, and with carefully planned cruise settings, even farther. The challenge was not only mechanical, but geographical. The United States needed forward bases close enough to Japan to make fighter escort viable. The invasion of Iwo Jima in February 1945 solved that problem. Though the battle was one of the bloodiest of the Pacific War, the small volcanic island became a priceless prize. From its airstrips, the P-51D could finally reach the Japanese mainland, a direct flight path to Tokyo. Within weeks, the first Mustang units, including the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups, arrived from the Marianas. Their mission was clear: protect the B-29s, sweep Japanese airfields, and dominate the skies over Honshu. For many of these pilots, the transition was almost surreal. The Pacific had long been a bomber's domain, but now, for the first time, single-engine fighters would patrol thousands of miles beyond the horizon. For the Japanese, this new reality was devastating. Their air defense network had already been weakened by fuel shortages and pilot losses. Elite units like the 343rd Naval Air Group, equipped with advanced aircraft such as the Kawanishi N1K2J Shidenkai and the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, struggled to maintain operational readiness. Each sortie consumed precious resources. When the first Mustangs appeared over Tokyo in early March 1945, Japanese ground crews were bewildered. Their interceptors had long been accustomed to B-29s flying alone, high, distant, and vulnerable. But now, agile silver fighters dove from the stratosphere to attack interceptors before they could climb into position. To those watching from the airfields, it seemed impossible. The Americans had found a way to erase the Pacific itself. Reports from the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service described high-altitude escorts with unmatched speed and endurance. Pilots reported dogfights where the enemy could dive, climb, and accelerate endlessly. The psychological shock was immense. Even before the bombs fell, morale began to fracture. The Pacific War had entered its final phase, one defined not by numbers, but by reach. The Mustang's arrival meant Japan's isolation was complete. There was no longer any refuge beyond Allied power, and as those long-range missions began, the world would soon witness how one aircraft came to symbolize the fusion of American engineering, endurance, and air supremacy. To understand how the P-51D redefined the very concept of air dominance, one must look beyond its graceful silhouette. Beneath its polished aluminum skin lay a design that embodied the most advanced aeronautical thinking of its era. A balance of power, efficiency, and intelligence that no other fighter could match in 1945. At the heart of its superiority was the laminar flow wing. Developed through wind tunnel testing at the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, this wing design minimized drag by keeping airflow smooth over its surface, even at high speeds. The result was a fighter that could cruise farther and faster with less fuel. An engineering breakthrough that turned distance from an obstacle into an advantage. Then came the engine. The Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin V1650-7, a 12-cylinder, liquid-cooled powerhouse, produced 1,695 horsepower at altitude. Combined with a two-stage, two-speed supercharger, it maintained power up to 30,000 feet, far above the ceiling of most Japanese fighters. Its steady torque and reliability allowed Mustang pilots to climb rapidly, chase down targets, and sustain combat at altitudes where others struggled to breathe. But range was the Mustang's true weapon. With two external fuel tanks, a P-51D could escort bombers from Iwo Jima to Tokyo, a 1,500-mile round trip, and still have fuel for dogfighting. It could loiter above enemy airfields, waiting for interceptors to rise. For Japanese defenders, this endurance was incomprehensible. Their Zeros and Kai-61s, brilliant in maneuverability, were crippled by limited range and fragile airframes. The Mustang could outlast them, outrun them, and return home safely. Inside the cockpit, American innovation extended to precision and survivability. The K-14 gyroscopic gun sight, newly fitted to the P-51D, revolutionized aerial combat. It calculated deflection automatically, allowing pilots to anticipate an enemy's movement and fire with unmatched accuracy. In the chaotic spirals of a dogfight, this was often the difference between life and death. The Mustang's .650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 3 per wing, offered concentrated firepower capable of shredding both fighters and bombers alike. Ammunition belts carried a mix of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds, tearing through engines, control surfaces, and fuel tanks. Even its visibility played a role in its dominance. The bubble canopy, introduced on the P-51D, granted a full 360-degree view, a luxury few fighters enjoyed. In the Pacific, where surprise meant survival, seeing first often meant winning first. Technically, the Mustang was not the fastest aircraft ever built, nor the most heavily armed. Its true genius lay in integration, the harmony between power, design, and purpose. Every component existed to support its mission: reach farther, stay longer, and dominate higher. For American pilots, this harmony bred confidence. They could engage on their terms, knowing that no Japanese interceptor could match both speed and altitude simultaneously. They could climb into the sun, dive through clouds, and still return home with fuel to spare. To the Japanese, the Mustang seemed to defy logic. A single-engine fighter that operated like a long-range bomber, yet fought like a knife. It was more than a weapon. It was the physical expression of industrial might, engineering precision, and tactical evolution. And behind the numbers and technology stood the men who flew them, pilots who understood that every mission from Iwo Jima would carry them to the edge of endurance and back. For the men who flew it, the P-51D Mustang was more than just a machine. It was freedom made tangible. Yet for those who faced it from below, it was a symbol of a war that could no longer be won. From their bases on Iwo Jima, American pilots prepared for missions that would stretch both machine and man to the limit. Each sortie over Japan meant hours of flight above open ocean, far from rescue or radio contact. The cockpit became a world of vibration, fuel gauges, and endless horizon. Pilots learned to ration oxygen, to trim the aircraft for hands-free flight, to navigate by dead reckoning when clouds swallowed the sun. Lieutenant John Voll of the 31st Fighter Group described the Mustang as the aircraft that never let you down. No matter how far you flew, it would bring you home. That confidence transformed how the U.S. Air Force fought. No longer were bombers isolated targets lumbering toward their fate. They now flew under constant watch, their silver guardians carving paths through flak and smoke. Meanwhile, on the ground in Japan, disbelief grew with each passing week. Reports flooded in from airbases near Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. Ground crews described fighters appearing alongside the bombers, remaining overhead long after the attack, circling as if invincible. Many thought at first that the Americans were using carriers closer than expected, but the truth was worse. The Mustangs were flying all the way from Iwo Jima, refueling only once, if at all, and returning with precision that defied comprehension. Japanese intelligence officers documented their observations with an undertone of awe. In post-war interrogations, several recalled their frustration at how the enemy had seemingly erased distance as a barrier. One naval engineer wrote, "Their fighter escorts no longer depended on the ocean's width. It was as though the Pacific had become their airfield." For Japanese pilots, the shock was both technical and emotional. The once proud Zero, once the terror of the early Pacific War, was now hopelessly outclassed. Even the advanced Ki-84 Hayate and N1K2J Shiden Kai, Japan's finest fighters, struggled against the Mustang's high-altitude agility and long-range endurance. Dogfights that had once been graceful duels turned into desperate escapes. Many young Japanese aviators were barely trained before being thrown into combat. Their instructors had been lost over the Philippines, Formosa, and the Marianas. By 1945, airfields across Honshu were filled with new recruits facing opponents who had already fought across Europe. Against the disciplined formations of P-51Ds, their chances were almost non-existent. On the ground, civilians grew accustomed to the distant hum of engines at high altitude, a sound that came to mean bombs, smoke, and ash. To them, the Mustangs were the untouchable hunters that hovered just beneath the bombers, always present, always beyond reach. There were moments of grim irony, too. Some Japanese mechanics who had once laughed at American designs in the 1930s now watched, helpless, as these same aircraft ruled their skies. The speed, the polish, the relentless presence, it shattered any illusion of parity. And yet, amid that shock, there was also a sense of reluctant respect. The Mustang represented not arrogance, but mastery, a culmination of lessons learned through years of loss and innovation. From the frozen skies of Europe to the burning fields of Honshu, the Mustang had proven what control of the air truly meant. But the story was far from over. In the spring of 1945, the Mustang would demonstrate its full power, not just in endurance, but in domination. March 4, 1945. Before dawn, Iwo Jima's new airfields, still raw from battle, trembled under the roar of hundreds of engines. The volcanic dust rose in choking clouds as mechanics armed, fueled, and checked each P-51D Mustang for the longest fighter mission ever attempted. The targets: Tokyo and its industrial lifelines. The mission: escort B-29 bombers all the way to the Japanese mainland and bring them home alive. The pilots of the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups stood by their aircraft, their faces streaked with sweat and dust. For many, this would be their first time over Japan. They knew the risks. The Mustang was fast and agile, but one engine failure over the ocean meant certain death. Yet none hesitated. The war had reached a point where every flight carried a weight beyond survival. At 7:00 a.m., they took off in tight formations, climbing steadily through thick cloud banks into the blinding sunlight. Beneath them stretched the endless Pacific, deep blue, silent, and empty. Ahead, more than 700 miles away, lay Tokyo. The flight lasted nearly 3 hours. Navigation was done by dead reckoning and celestial cues. Radio silence was kept to avoid detection. Each pilot monitored fuel constantly. Drop tanks first, then internal reserves. The Mustang's long-range tanks gave them an unprecedented reach, but precision mattered. A miscalculation of 10 minutes could mean running out of fuel before sighting Iwo Jima again. As the coast of Japan appeared, tension shifted to focus. The bombers of the 20th Air Force, their silver B-29s glinting in formation, were already crossing into enemy territory. It was the first time American fighters would accompany them this far. Then came the Japanese response. Radar operators near Tokyo detected the incoming formation, and the order went out. Intercept. Dozens of Ki-84 Hayates, Ki-61 Tonys, and A6M50s scrambled from bases at Atsugi, Chofu, and Tachikawa. But when they climbed into the upper atmosphere, they found something new waiting: the Mustangs. With the sun at their backs, the American fighters dove in pairs and fours, their .650 caliber guns flashing. The dogfights that followed were fierce but brief. Japanese aircraft, starved of high-octane fuel and flown by increasingly inexperienced pilots, could not match the Mustang's speed or vertical maneuvering. One Japanese ace later recalled, "They appeared from nowhere, struck once, and were gone before we could turn." For the B-29 crews, the difference was immediate. Where once waves of interceptors had swarmed their formations, now only scattered attacks broke through. Radio chatter filled with relief. Little friends, the affectionate term bomber crews used for their escorts, had finally come to the Pacific. From the ground, the reaction was disbelief. Observers in Tokyo's air defense network reported enemy fighters of great speed accompanying the bombers. Many thought it was propaganda, until they saw the contrails themselves. Thin streaks weaving tightly between the heavy bomber lines. When the formation turned for home hours later, not a single Mustang was lost to fuel exhaustion. The experiment had worked. The range, endurance, and discipline of the P-51D had redefined what air power could do. In that single day, Japan's strategic defense network had been exposed as vulnerable not just to bombers, but to complete Allied control of the air. And this was only the beginning. The following weeks would see the Mustang's full fury unleashed across the Japanese mainland. The success of the March 4th mission electrified the 20th Air Force. Within days, new escort operations were planned. Iwo Jima's airstrips, Motoyama No. 1 and No. 2, became the launching point for a relentless series of strikes that would turn the Japanese mainland into a battlefield in the sky. By late March 1945, Mustang formations were launching almost daily. Their tasks varied: high-altitude escort, low-level strafing, and airfield suppression. But their impact was the same: destruction of Japan's remaining air capability. The P-51Ds of the 15th, 21st, and 506th Fighter Groups soon became synonymous with precision and dominance. The Japanese tried to adapt. Fighters from the elite 343rd Naval Air Group, commanded by Captain Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most brilliant tacticians, scrambled to intercept. Genda's pilots flew the best aircraft Japan had left, the Shinden-Kai, or George. Fast, heavily armed, and well-handled, it could match the Mustang in brief bursts. But these aircraft were few, their pilots fewer still. Each loss was irreplaceable. On April 7, 1945, one of the largest air battles of the Pacific War erupted over Tokyo Bay. Nearly 100 P-51Ds escorted B-29s, striking industrial and naval facilities. Japanese radar stations detected the formation and scrambled every available interceptor. Dozens of Hayates and Shidonkais climbed desperately, meeting the Mustangs head-on in the thin air above 25,000 feet. The battle lasted nearly an hour. Mustang pilots reported constant attacks from below, but the Japanese aircraft faltered in the climb, their engines straining against fuel shortages and poor maintenance. The Americans controlled the vertical, diving, firing, and climbing again with ease. When it was over, more than 40 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. The Mustangs lost only 2. For those on the ground, it was a scene of chaos. Airfields that had once launched interceptors became graveyards of twisted metal. Mechanics tried to drag wrecks aside while others filled craters left by strafing runs. The Mustang pilots had shifted tactics. When not escorting B-29s, they flew fighter sweeps, hunting enemy planes on the ground. They attacked hangars, runways, fuel dumps, anything that could still move or burn. Japanese anti-aircraft crews were overwhelmed. Their guns, designed to hit bombers, could barely track the fast, low-flying Mustangs. The sound of the Merlin engine became a warning. Sharp, mechanical, unrelenting. In many regions, civilians began calling them silver ghosts. By May, air defense across Honshu was collapsing. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Service admitted in secret reports that continuous operations were impossible. Fuel reserves had dwindled to days. Even when new fighters were rolled from factories, there were no pilots left skilled enough to fly them. The psychological effect was as severe as the material losses. Pilots who once boasted of Japan's air superiority now spoke in hushed tones about the Americans' reach. They could appear over Tokyo in the morning, Osaka by noon, and vanish over the Pacific before dusk. The sky, once a shield, had become a weapon against them. When General Curtis LeMay shifted B-29 raids from precision bombing to low-level incendiary attacks in March and April, the Mustangs followed them down to the cities. They strafed trains, convoys, and airfields, ensuring that no response could form. The strategy was ruthless, but effective. By June, Japan's air defense was no longer an organized system, but a scattering of isolated outposts. The Mustang had done what no aircraft in history had accomplished, achieved total air control over a nation still at war. And as the fires of Tokyo burned, the realization set in. Japan's defeat was no longer a question of if, but when. By July 1945, Japan's once proud air arm existed only on paper. The Mustang's campaign, alongside the unrelenting raids of the B-29s, had carved away the nation's aerial defense piece by piece. What had begun as a series of desperate interceptions had ended as silence in the skies. At airfields across Honshu and Kyushu, hundreds of aircraft sat motionless, some incomplete, some cannibalized for parts, others simply grounded for lack of fuel. Mechanics who once worked through the night to ready fighters for dawn sorties now stood idle, their workshops empty, their tools gathering dust. The great industrial machine that once supported Japan's war effort had collapsed under blockade and bombardment. Official records from the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service reveal staggering losses. Between March and August 1945, over 3,500 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, more than half on the ground. In contrast, P-51D losses numbered fewer than 250, many to mechanical failure or fuel exhaustion rather than enemy fire. The exchange ratio was beyond anything seen before in aerial warfare. The Mustang had become a symbol of total domination. Its polished aluminum skin, glinting in the sun as it roared over a nation stripped of its defenses. The Japanese could only watch. Even the most fanatical pilots began to grasp the futility. Letters recovered from captured airmen tell a quiet story of disbelief. "They come from nowhere," wrote one pilot near Osaka in June. "They are above us before we hear them. Our warning sirens mean nothing now." In Tokyo, military planners faced an impossible situation. They no longer had the ability to defend vital industries or cities. Every fuel convoy, every rail line, every port was vulnerable. Mustang flights strafed factories that had already been burned once, ensuring that no recovery was possible. The collapse of the air defense network had wider consequences than the Japanese command could have imagined. The U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet could now operate dangerously close to the home islands. Naval task forces launched attacks with near impunity, covered by long-range fighters from Iwo Jima. American reconnaissance units flew over Japan daily, photographing everything. No radar, no patrols, no resistance. The few surviving pilots of the 343rd Naval Air Group were ordered to preserve their aircraft for the final defense of Kyushu. Operation Ketsugo, Japan's planned counterstrike against an Allied invasion. But most never received that chance. Each new raid destroyed another airfield, another reserve of aircraft, another squadron's hope of readiness. The Mustang's reach changed not just tactics, but the psychology of the war. Japan's soldiers, once taught to believe their homeland was invulnerable, now watched daylight raids unfold overhead without interruption. For civilians, the aircraft's sleek silhouette became a sign of both fear and inevitability. The image of an enemy that could not be stopped, only endured. Even Germany's Luftwaffe, months earlier, had fallen under similar pressure. But Japan's collapse was more absolute. Its geography, once its greatest defense, had been turned against it. The same Pacific Ocean that once protected the islands now allowed American airfields to be built within striking distance. By the end of July, the U.S. Army Air Forces reported a new reality. Complete air supremacy over the Japanese homeland achieved. The phrase appeared in mission summaries, cold and bureaucratic, but it marked the end of an era. The war was not yet over, but Japan's ability to resist had already been broken in the skies. When the air raids finally stopped, the silence felt unnatural. Entire cities lay flattened, their factories cold, their airfields empty. But beneath the ashes, Japan's people and soldiers were left to confront a different kind of devastation. The realization that their skies had belonged to someone else. For many Japanese soldiers and civilians, the first close encounter with the Americans came not through battle, but through captivity. As U.S. forces captured islands across the Pacific and later entered Japan itself, airmen, mechanics, and naval personnel surrendered in numbers once unthinkable. The stories they told revealed both disbelief and reluctant respect for the Americans, power. Japanese aircrew captured on Iwo Jima and later in Kyushu described their shock at seeing the P-51D up close. Its cockpit instruments, hydraulic systems, and precision-manufactured engine components seemed decades ahead of Japan's designs. "We thought their planes were made by machines. We could never build," one prisoner told U.S. interrogators in August 1945. Everything was perfect. Not one bolt seemed handmade. Others spoke about what they had witnessed during the raids, not just the aircraft's dominance, but the Americans' coordination. From the Japanese perspective, it was as if the U.S. pilots and ground crews shared a single mind. Every sortie launched exactly on time. Every return was guided, refueled, and rearmed within hours. For Japanese mechanics used to shortages and improvisation, it was incomprehensible. Their aircraft were often fueled by hand pumps, maintained with scavenged parts, and armed with ammunition assembled from mismatched batches. The Americans, by contrast, operated as an industrial force of nature. POWs taken after the war's end would later describe visiting American bases. To them, the airfields were like small cities, lined with rows of identical aircraft, spare parts stocked in warehouses, mechanics working around the clock in spotless conditions. One pilot remarked that a single U.S. airbase seemed to have more equipment than the entire Japanese homeland had left in 1945. The hide, luxury and organization of American life behind. The front lines also stunned them. POW camps were supplied with cigarettes, coffee, and even newspapers. Japanese officers, raised to believe that surrender to Americans meant humiliation or cruelty, found themselves treated with a form of respect they couldn't have imagined. For many, it was disorienting. The realization that the enemy they had fought was not only militarily superior, but also living in a different kind of world. German prisoners would express similar feelings earlier in Europe. They, too, were astonished by the Americans' casual abundance: food, radios, cigarettes, and mail service from home. But for the Japanese, who had fought on isolated islands under starvation and disease, the contrast was almost surreal. Letters written by Japanese officers after the surrender reflect this quiet shock. Their planes flew as if distance did not exist, one wrote from a POW camp in Guam. Their factories are everywhere, even in the ocean. The Mustang became more than a weapon. It was a symbol of a civilization that had mastered the machinery of modern war. Its pilots were not seen as reckless or cruel, but as confident, disciplined, and utterly assured in their victory. When Japan formally surrendered on September 16, 1945, a formation of P-51Ds flew overhead the deck of the USS Missouri. It was a silent statement. The same aircraft that had ruled Japan's skies now escorted peace itself. For many watching from below, it was the final confirmation of what they had already known. The war in the air had ended long before the ink touched the paper. The story of the P-51D Mustang is more than the tale of a superior fighter. It is the story of how technology, industry, and endurance combined to define the modern age of warfare. It began as a hurried British request in 1940, and ended as the aircraft that bridged oceans, broke empires, and ushered in a new era of global reach. For Japan, the Mustang was the embodiment of what had gone wrong: isolation, limited resources, and a rigid command structure unable to adapt to the pace of modern war. For America, it symbolized something deeper: the triumph of ingenuity and the unity of an industrial democracy at total war. Every pilot, engineer, and mechanic who worked on the Mustang carried a piece of that transformation. By the war's end, the P-51D had flown over 200,000 missions, destroyed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft, and escorted B-29s across distances once thought impossible. But its true victory was psychological. It erased the boundary between air power and distance, proving that no nation, no matter how far, could remain beyond the reach of precision and will. When the guns fell silent, many Mustangs were scrapped or sold. Yet their legacy endured, in the design of every jet fighter that followed, and in the quiet respect of those who once faced them in the sky. The P-51D did not just rule both sky and distance, it redefined what power itself could mean.